Sherman Oaks, California. A warm Saturday afternoon. Ventura Boulevard buzzed with its usual traffic. Cars crawled through intersections. Palm trees swayed gently in the California sun. A few blocks away from the noise, inside a modest martial arts dojo on Ventura Boulevard, more than 400 martial artists filled every available seat. Some had driven for hours to be there. Some had flown in from other states. Some had cancelled classes at their own schools just to attend. This was not a crowd of beginners. There were karate instructors, judo black belts, kung fu practitioners, former tournament champions, senior students who had spent decades studying combat, men and women who knew the difference between performance and skill, the kind of people who watched carefully, the kind of people who noticed details, the kind of people who rarely applauded unless something genuinely impressed them. On this particular Saturday, they had come for one reason. Steven Seagal. At 36 years old, Steven Seagal was becoming one of the most talked about martial artists in America. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighed nearly 230 pounds, held a 7th degree black belt in Aikido, had spent over a decade training in Japan, and rumors about an upcoming Hollywood film deal had already begun spreading through martial arts circles. To many people in the room, he represented something unusual, an American who had successfully immersed himself in traditional Japanese martial arts and returned with credentials that few Westerners possessed. The anticipation was obvious. People filled every row. Late arrivals stood against the walls. Some sat cross-legged on the floor. Others leaned against support pillars near the back of the dojo. Everyone wanted a clear view. Everyone wanted to see whether Steven Seagal truly lived up to his reputation. At exactly 1:45 p.m., movement near the staircase caught everyone's attention. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Steven Seagal had arrived. He entered the dojo with 4 senior students following closely behind him. All 4 wore spotless white uniforms, black belts tied neatly around their waists. Their posture alone announced years of training. Steven walked at the center of the group, confident, relaxed, completely comfortable being the focus of attention. The crowd naturally parted as he crossed the dojo floor. He bowed respectfully toward the front wall, then turned toward the audience. A smile appeared, the kind of smile instructors develop after years of teaching. Warm enough to be welcoming, confident enough to command authority. Applause filled the room. Steven nodded. "Thank you for coming." His voice carried easily through the dojo. No microphone necessary. The seminar began. At first, everything went exactly as people expected, perhaps even better. Steven explained the principles of Aikido with clarity and precision. Centering, balance, redirection of force, control rather than collision. The philosophical foundations behind every movement. The audience listened attentively. Many took notes. Others simply watched. Then came the demonstrations, and they were impressive, very impressive. Steven selected one of his assistants. The assistant attacked. Steven moved. The technique happened so smoothly that many spectators almost missed the details. A wrist lock, a rotation, a throw. The assistant landed safely on the mat. The room nodded approvingly. Then another demonstration, and another. Standing throws, joint manipulations, pins, escapes, transitions. Every technique appeared polished, refined, professional. His assistants flew through the air with practiced precision. Years of repetition showed in every movement. The crowd appreciated what they were seeing. Several senior instructors leaned forward. A few exchanged impressed glances. Even practitioners from completely different martial arts systems nodded occasionally. Good technique is recognizable regardless of style. For the first 40 minutes, the seminar felt exactly like what everyone had paid for. A skilled instructor teaching a skilled audience. Nothing controversial, nothing dramatic, just martial arts. But hidden among the 400 attendees sat someone nobody had recognized. Third row, slightly left of center. A man wearing a navy blue baseball cap pulled low, gray sweatshirt, blue jeans, running shoes. No entourage, no introduction, no special treatment. He had purchased a ticket like everyone else, walked through the front door like everyone else, taken a seat like everyone else. Most people never looked at him twice. Why would they? He looked ordinary, deliberately ordinary. The man sat quietly, watching, listening, studying. Not just the techniques, the teacher, the timing, the structure, the assumptions behind every movement, the way experienced martial artists always watch. A few people nearby vaguely recognized him. Something seemed familiar. But the cap concealed much of his face, and nobody expected him to be there, so nobody gave the thought much attention. Meanwhile, Steven Seagal continued demonstrating. The applause grew louder after each sequence. Confidence grew with it. The room admired him. The techniques worked beautifully. The audience respected what they were seeing. And like many successful men before him, Steven began feeling something dangerous. Not arrogance. Not yet. Something smaller, something quieter. The feeling that comes when hundreds of people spend 40 uninterrupted minutes agreeing with you. The feeling that whispers, maybe you're right about everything. Few people notice when that feeling arrives. Steven didn't notice either. Not yet. But the man in the third row did. Because he had spent most of his life watching talented people make that exact mistake. The man beneath the navy baseball cap continued observing quietly, patiently, almost invisibly, waiting. Not because he expected trouble, not because he wanted trouble, simply because experience had taught him something. The most revealing moments rarely happen during demonstrations. They happen afterward, when people start talking. And 40 minutes into the seminar, Steven Seagal reached for a microphone. The man in the third row slowly raised his eyes, because somewhere deep inside, he had a feeling, a very familiar feeling. And before the afternoon ended, 400 martial artists would discover exactly why. For the first 40 minutes, everything had gone perfectly. The crowd was engaged, the demonstrations were sharp, the applause came naturally. Steven Seagal stood at the front of the dojo exactly where he wanted to be, in control, respected, admired. 400 martial artists watched his every movement, and almost every one of them agreed that what they were seeing was impressive. His wrist locks were precise, his throws were smooth, his understanding of balance and leverage was obvious. Even practitioners from completely different systems found themselves nodding occasionally. Skill recognizes skill. For 40 uninterrupted minutes, Steven Seagal had earned the room. That should have been enough. For most instructors, it would have been. But success sometimes creates a dangerous hunger. The desire to keep winning after you've already won. The desire to push just a little further. The desire to turn admiration into dominance. Steven picked up the microphone. The crowd settled immediately. Some students adjusted notebooks, others leaned forward, a few instructors folded their arms and prepared to listen. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Steven continued discussing Aikido, its principles, its philosophy, its advantages. The audience followed along comfortably. Then his tone shifted. Subtly, almost imperceptibly. I believe Aikido is the most complete martial art in the world. Nobody reacted negatively. Statements like that were common in martial arts circles. Karate instructors said similar things about karate. Kung Fu teachers said similar things about Kung Fu. Judo instructors said similar things about Judo. Pride in one's system was expected. The audience accepted it. Several people nodded. Steven continued. Aikido teaches timing. He paced slowly across the floor. Aikido teaches control. A pause. Aikido teaches what happens in real conflict. The room remained comfortable, still listening, still supportive. Then he crossed a line. Not a dramatic line, a small one. The kind that only becomes obvious after it's crossed. He smiled, a confident smile, and said, Tournament karate teaches something different. The room became slightly quieter, not silent, just attentive. Many people attending the seminar came from karate backgrounds. They wanted to hear where this was going. Steven continued. Tournament karate is choreography. A few eyebrows rose. The smile remained on his face. The trophies, a small shrug. The points, another shrug. The rules. Several karate instructors exchanged glances. The atmosphere had changed, not dramatically, but noticeably. Steven kept going. The audience loves it. Some nervous laughter appeared. Very little, not enough. He should have noticed. He didn't. It's performance. The room became still, not hostile, just cautious. The kind of stillness that appears when intelligent people are deciding whether they agree with something. Several tournament champions sat quietly, listening, waiting. The older instructors seemed particularly uncomfortable. Many had dedicated decades to karate, built schools around it, raised families through it, given their bodies to it. They weren't offended yet, but they were no longer applauding. Steven mistook the silence for agreement. That was his second mistake. His first mistake had been speaking. His second was continuing. If those same fighters ever faced a real opponent, a pause. They would discover very quickly that trophies don't help. Nobody laughed. Nobody nodded. The room remained motionless. 400 martial artists. 400 people suddenly evaluating not his techniques, but his judgment. The third row remained quiet. The man beneath the navy baseball cap never moved, never reacted, never interrupted. He simply listened. Steven continued speaking. The crowd continued listening. Then something happened. Something that would change the afternoon. Steven glanced across the audience, saw hundreds of faces looking toward him, and felt the temptation that destroys many talented people. The temptation to say something memorable, something people would repeat, something that would make headlines. He smiled again, then said, "The most famous example of this problem is Chuck Norris." The dojo froze. Instantly, not gradually, instantly. Several people looked up so fast their chairs creaked. Others stopped taking notes. The silence became absolute. Because everyone knew that name. Everyone. Karate practitioners, kung fu practitioners, judo practitioners, students, instructors, tournament champions. Every person in the room. Chuck Norris wasn't merely famous. He was respected, especially among martial artists. The room waited, hoping Steven would stop. He didn't. Chuck Norris built an entire career on tournament karate. The silence deepened. He built movies around it. Another pause. The room felt smaller. And people think that makes him a complete fighter. The crowd was no longer listening comfortably. They were enduring. Steven looked completely unaware. The microphone amplified every word, every sentence, every mistake. Then came the statement. The one that would be repeated for decades. The one people would remember long after the seminar ended. Steven smiled and said, "If Chuck Norris ever walked into my dojo..." A pause. A fatal pause. The room held its breath. Steven finished. He'd be flat on his back in less than a minute. Silence. No applause. No laughter. Nothing. 400 martial artists stared. Some looked shocked. Others looked embarrassed. Several stared at the floor. The atmosphere felt completely different now. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Because everyone understood something Steven didn't. When you challenge a man publicly, you are responsible for what happens if he answers. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. 3. 5. Then something moved. Not at the front, not near the stage, not near Steven. Third row. The man wearing the navy baseball cap slowly stood up. Nobody noticed at first. Then someone did. Then another. Then another. Like falling dominoes, heads turned, rows shifted. People leaned sideways to see. The man stepped into the aisle, calmly. No anger, no hurry, no performance. Just quiet purpose. He began walking toward the front of the dojo. The crowd parted automatically. Something about him demanded space, even before they recognized him. Step, step, step. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath his shoes. Steven watched, confused. The man continued forward, reached the front row, stopped, then removed the baseball cap. The effect was immediate. A collective gasp swept through the room. Dozens of people stood. Several instructors whispered the same words simultaneously. "Oh my God!" One photographer nearly dropped his camera. Another simply stared, unable to move. Because standing in front of Steven Seagal, only a few feet away, was Chuck Norris. The real Chuck Norris, who had been sitting in the third row for the entire seminar, and suddenly every person in the dojo understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. Steven Seagal had not been speaking about an absent man. He had been speaking directly to him. And now, the man he had challenged was standing in front of him. The dojo went silent. Not ordinary silence, not the silence of people waiting for instructions. This was something different. The kind of silence that arrives when 400 people suddenly realize they are witnessing a moment that will be talked about for years. Chuck Norris stood at the front of the room, navy baseball cap in his left hand, gray sweatshirt hanging loosely from his shoulders. His expression calm, composed, almost relaxed. Across from him, Steven Seagal remained frozen. Only seconds earlier, he had been speaking confidently into a microphone. Now, the microphone hung forgotten at his side. The room watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to interrupt what was happening. Chuck broke the silence first. His voice was quiet, polite, the kind of voice that never needed volume. "I heard my name." A few nervous laughs appeared, then vanished immediately. Nobody knew what would happen next. Chuck looked directly at Steven, not angrily, not aggressively, just directly. "I was wondering if you'd like to repeat what you just said." The sentence landed like a hammer, not because it was loud, because it wasn't, because everybody understood exactly what it meant. Steven said nothing. For several seconds. The pause stretched. 1 second, 2, 3, 5. 400 people watched his face, and in those few seconds, several emotions appeared. First surprise, then calculation, then uncertainty, then something else. Pride. The kind of pride that makes retreat impossible. Steven was 6'4", 230 pounds, 12 years in Japan, a 7th degree black belt. 400 martial artists watching. Backing down wasn't an option. Not anymore. Not here. Slowly he nodded. Of course. The answer sounded confident, but not as confident as before. Chuck nodded once. No smile, no celebration, no reaction. He simply handed his cap to a man in the front row, then removed the gray sweatshirt, folded it carefully, placed it beside the cap. Underneath was a plain white t-shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. Just a man who looked like he had spent his entire life training. The crowd studied him. 48 years old, smaller than Steven, older than Steven, lighter than Steven. Yet somehow nobody in the room viewed him as the underdog. That fact alone felt strange. Steven removed his uniform jacket, now standing in white training pants and a black t-shirt. Both men stepped onto the center of the dojo floor. The crowd automatically moved backward, creating space, creating history. 400 people, complete silence. Chuck stood naturally, hands relaxed at his sides. No visible fighting stance, no dramatic preparation, no intimidation. Steven lowered into an Aikido stance, balanced, ready. The stance he had used thousands of times. The stance that had solved problems for 12 years. The stance he trusted. The sunlight streamed through the dojo windows. The wooden floor remained perfectly still beneath them. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then Steven moved, fast. His right hand shot forward, reaching for Chuck's wrist. A classic Aikido entry, the beginning of countless techniques, the foundation of his system. Get the wrist, control the arm, apply the lock, finish the encounter. Simple, proven, reliable. Except this time, the wrist wasn't there. Chuck had already moved. Only 6 inches, barely enough to notice, yet enough, always enough. Steven's hand closed on empty air. At the same moment, Chuck's front kick touched the outside of Steven's lead knee. Lightly, not hard, not damaging. A message. The crowd understood immediately. You cannot reach me. Steven stepped back, reset. The dojo remained silent. The first exchange had lasted less than 3 seconds, yet already something felt wrong. Steven's nervous system was receiving information it didn't like. The technique should have worked. The distance should have closed. The wrist should have been there. Instead, nothing. Steven moved again. This time, both hands came forward, open, seeking contact, seeking control, seeking any grip he could establish. Chuck stepped left. A simple movement, nothing flashy. Then a jab. A basic lead hand punch, the kind boxers practice thousands of times. The punch landed lightly against Steven's shoulder. Tap. Not power, precision. Another message. I can touch you. You can't touch me. The room understood. Several senior instructors exchanged glances. They were beginning to see the problem. Aikido required connection. Chuck was refusing connection. Steven reset again, now breathing slightly harder, not exhausted, confused. The crowd could see it. The techniques weren't failing because they were poorly executed. They were failing because the fight existed at the wrong distance. And Chuck Norris controlled that distance completely. Steven committed forward a third time, this time aggressively, a larger entry. A longer reach, a greater commitment, trying to bridge the gap, trying to force the encounter into the range where Aikido lived. Chuck pivoted, effortlessly. Then came the movement everyone would remember, the movement that would become legend. His body rotated, the famous spinning back kick, the kick that had won championships, the kick that students around the world had studied frame by frame. The kick rose, fast, perfect, precise. The crowd watched in disbelief. Steven watched in disbelief. The heel approached, closer, 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 then stopped. Exactly 1 inch from Steven Seagal's left temple. 1 inch. No contact, no impact, no damage, just certainty. Chuck held the position, half a second, long enough for every person in the room to understand. If the kick had continued, the seminar was over, the conversation was over, everything was over. Then Chuck lowered his foot, stepped backward, and returned to a relaxed stance, hands at his sides, calm, silent. The encounter had lasted 47 seconds. 47 seconds, shorter than a television commercial, shorter than most conversations. Yet somehow it felt much longer. Because inside those 47 seconds, 400 martial artists had learned something important. Something that couldn't be explained with trophies, credentials, ranks, titles, or movie contracts. The dojo remained silent. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. Nobody moved. because everyone was still trying to process what they had just seen. And standing in the center of the room, Steven Seagal was beginning to understand something far more important than defeat. He was discovering the exact boundary of what he knew. For several seconds after the kick stopped, nobody moved. The dojo remained frozen. 400 martial artists. 400 people staring at the exact same image. Chuck Norris standing calmly. Steven Seagal standing perfectly still. 1 inch, that was all. 1 inch between what happened and what could have happened. The distance felt microscopic, yet somehow enormous, because everyone in the room understood its meaning. Chuck Norris had not missed. He had stopped. And there is a profound difference between those two things. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Nobody seemed willing to break it. The senior instructor sat motionless. The tournament champions remained frozen. Even Steven's 4 assistants stood perfectly still at the edge of the mat, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to interpret. The lesson had already been delivered, clearly, completely, publicly. Steven Seagal stood in the center of the dojo. His hands remained slightly raised. His breathing had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for experienced fighters to notice. Because something inside him was happening. Not physical, mental. The collision between belief and reality. A difficult collision, perhaps the most difficult kind. Chuck waited. Quietly. Patiently. Not because he wanted an apology, not because he wanted recognition. Simply because he understood something. The next few moments would matter more than the previous 47 seconds. Anybody can lose. The real test begins afterward. The dojo watched. Steven slowly lowered his hands. The movement seemed surprisingly heavy, as though the weight of the afternoon had suddenly settled onto his shoulders. For several moments he stared at the floor. Not defeated, thinking. The crowd remained silent. No one wanted to interrupt, because everybody recognized what was happening. A choice, an important one. Every martial artist eventually reaches moments like this, moments where reality presents 2 paths. One path protects the ego, the other develops the person. The first path is easier, the second path is valuable. Steven looked up. His eyes found Chuck Norris. Then he began walking forward. Slowly, deliberately. No excuses, no explanations, no speeches, just footsteps. The entire dojo watched. Several people later admitted they remembered this walk more vividly than the sparring itself. Because during those few seconds, something changed. Not outside, inside. Steven stopped 2 feet away from Chuck. Neither man spoke immediately. The room waited. Then Steven extended his hand. Simple, direct, honest. A gesture everyone understood. The dojo remained completely silent. Steven finally spoke. His voice sounded different now. Quieter, more sincere. I was wrong. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Because those 3 words carried enormous weight. Steven continued. No excuses. No conditions. No qualifications. I shouldn't have said what I said. Another pause. Then I spoke out of turn. The room remained silent, but something had changed. The tension was gone. The embarrassment was gone. Because genuine accountability has a strange effect on people. It immediately changes the atmosphere. Chuck looked at the extended hand, then at Steven. His expression never changed. Calm, respectful, professional. He took the hand, one firm shake. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just respect. The way martial artists are supposed to resolve things. Then Chuck nodded. I appreciate that. That was all. No lecture, no victory speech, no humiliation. Because Chuck Norris had never come to the front of the dojo to embarrass anyone. He came because his name had been used, and because sometimes reality needs representation. The handshake ended. The room finally breathed again. Several instructors relaxed visibly. A few students exchanged relieved looks. The pressure that had filled the dojo for nearly an hour finally disappeared. But the lesson remained, and it would remain for decades. Chuck looked around the room briefly. 400 faces, 400 witnesses. Then he glanced toward the front row. Someone handed him his navy baseball cap. Another handed him the folded gray sweatshirt. Chuck smiled politely, pulled the sweatshirt over his white t-shirt, placed the cap back on his head. And just like that, the most famous martial artist in America became anonymous again. At least as anonymous as Chuck Norris could be. He nodded politely to several nearby students, then turned toward the staircase. The same staircase he had climbed earlier that afternoon. The crowd naturally parted. Nobody asked for autographs. Nobody asked for photographs. The moment felt too important for that. Instead, people simply watched him leave. Several students lightly touched his shoulder as he passed, not to stop him, not to get attention, just to confirm something, that he had really been there, that they had really witnessed it. Chuck acknowledged each gesture with a small nod, never breaking stride. He reached the stairs. The old wooden steps creaked beneath his shoes. 1, 2, 3. The sounds echoed softly through the dojo. Then he disappeared downstairs. Moments later, the front door closed, and Chuck Norris was gone. The dojo remained quiet. Steven stood at the front for a long time. The seminar still had 30 minutes remaining, and to his credit, he finished it. Not because he had to, because he chose to. The remaining demonstrations were technically excellent. The wrist locks still worked. The throws remained clean. The explanations remained accurate. Yet something had changed. Not the techniques, the perspective. Everyone in the room felt it, including Steven, especially Steven. Because now every demonstration carried an invisible lesson beside it. A lesson about distance. A lesson about assumptions. A lesson about testing ideas against reality. The seminar eventually ended. People gathered their bags, folded notebooks, collected equipment, then slowly began leaving. But nobody left talking about wrist locks. Nobody left discussing throws. Nobody left talking about Aikido. They left discussing 47 seconds. 47 seconds that challenged assumptions. 47 seconds that reminded 400 martial artists of something important. Technique that only works under ideal conditions remains a theory. Technique that works against resistance becomes a skill. And the difference between theory and skill can only be discovered one way, by testing it. Years passed, then decades. The story spread throughout California martial arts circles. Senior instructors told it to students. Students told it to training partners. Training partners told it to future generations. Details changed. Names sometimes changed. Small parts grew larger. Other parts grew smaller. But the lesson never changed. The lesson survived because it was true. Not the lesson about Chuck Norris. Not the lesson about Steven Seagal. The larger lesson. The one every martial artist eventually learns. Humility is not weakness. Testing your beliefs is not failure. And sometimes the most valuable thing that can happen to a fighter is discovering the precise edge of what they know. Because beyond that edge, real growth begins.